In this video, we'll talk about our visit to Utah in October 2022. We visited 3 national parks, Capitol Reef, Canyonlands, and Arches, and we also visited Dead Horse Point State Park. This took 5 full days plus travel days at either end. We started at Capitol Reef National Park. We included a trail map in case anyone wants to go back and check out the locations of these trails. Here's the entrance to the park. Our usual first stop is at the visitor center. Our first hike is in the Grand Wash area. It follows a wash, which is currently dry. There are some natural photo booths along the way. In many areas, you have a choice between walking on a trail or walking in the wash itself. We typically just walked in the wash. We found that it was a lot more convenient and definitely more scenic. You've probably noticed that the lighting has a huge impact on the perceived colors, and that's really true for this entire area. Next, we went to an area called Capitol Gorge, and we stopped here and had some lunch before going on to the trail. Next, we took a drive to go to see some petroglyphs. This area was very scenic, just driving along almost anywhere you felt like stopping and taking pictures. Petroglyphs are drawings inscribed on rock by ancient peoples. They're not always easy to see at first. However, if you zoom in, you can see them much more clearly. That seems like pretty good proof that there were ancient aliens here after all. We stayed at a place called the Capitol Reef Resort, which was just outside the park's boundaries. These are just some scenes walking around behind the hotel. The fall foliage is doing quite well. In the summer, you can also stay in either a teepee or in a Conestoga wagon. They sell this as a glamping experience. However, before October, they shut them down. They also offer horseback rides and llama rides just behind the hotel here. At sunset, we went to Sunset Point, which is a good place to watch the colors change quite drastically as the sun sets. The next morning, we drove on to Arches National Park and started checking out some of the sights. One of the first areas to visit is called Park Avenue. Once again, you see huge differences in the apparent color just based on whether you're in full sunlight or in a shadow. Moving further into the park, you start to see a lot more strange rock formations. In the distance here, we're starting to approach a rock formation called the Three Gossips. They become more apparent in this picture. We never did find out the name of this rock formation, even though there was a sign practically right in front of it naming everything else in the area. This is the balanced rock, which looks like it's about to topple over. Now we're in the windows area, where we start to see some arches. This is called the Parade of Elephants, although it's more obvious from some other views. This is a distant viewpoint for the delicate arch, shown here in the center left distance. However, we were completely underwhelmed by this view, so we decided we really had to hike directly to it. But that's for another day. Next, we went to an area called the Fiery Furnace. It was obviously named because it's so red. We went near sunset, so that really exaggerated the redness. The Park Service helped out too, even by painting the post somewhat red and by painting or by using rocks that were red, taken from this area, building it right into the asphalt. The gaps between the rocks in the fiery furnace are extremely narrow, which makes this very popular for hiking because it's quite different experience. However, you're only allowed to go in there with a ranger. The problem is that because the rocks are so close together, you can't see much of anything except directly above you, and so people get disoriented and could get lost in there forever. For visiting both Arches National Park and Canyonlands, we stayed in Moab, and we stayed in particular at the Best Western Plus Canyonlands Inn. There are two different Best Western Pluses almost across the street from each other. This is the particular one that happens to have a Tesla supercharger for those who need that. Should be noted that none of the three parks we went to here have any kind of lodging inside of the parks themselves. That's unusual. Most national parks, the big national parks, have some kind of a lodge. These don't, so you always have to stay outside. And that's why we stayed outside both in Capitol Reef and why we stayed in Moab for the other parks. We were warned by the park rangers at Arches that the next day was going to be extremely busy to the point where if we didn't get there by 6 or 7 in the morning, we probably wouldn't even be allowed in. The problem was it was a weekend when they're normally busy, and there was going to be a storm moving in Sunday, so that Saturday was going to be kind of a free for all. And so we decided to go to Canyonlands instead on the next day. Then we could go back to Arches when it was less crowded. There are two visitor centers at Canyonlands, and we visited the one called Island in the Sky. It's called Island in the Sky because you're mostly on top of a high mesa looking down into canyons below you. Our first stop is at the Schaefer Canyon Overlook. The trailhead has some gnarly vegetation, but you then quickly find out that you're at a very spectacular overlook. It was also windy and dusty at times, as you can see in some of these photos. It's an easy walk out to that point, and you see a lot of interesting views along the way. This is an old mining road. You can walk down it, or you could even take a small car down it. With the wind, we had to hold our hats very tightly. Our next stop was the Mesa Arch Trail. That's the Mesa Arch. It's views like this, looking through Mesa Arch, that made it so famous. It's especially famous for pictures taken at sunrise. Trails then continue along the edge of the mesa. These people were walking along and taking pictures on a lower level trail. There are primitive outhouses at the trailheads in most of these parks. I'm always amazed that people really need such explicit instructions, including with the explicit graphics, on how to use these toilets. Our next stop was Upheaval Dome. This is a crater filled with material completely unlike anything else in the park. The current thinking is it's probably from a meteorite. This interesting backstory is more interesting than the actual appearance. This is the view from the first overlook point. We are panning across from one side to the other. After leaving Canyonlands, we made a brief stop at the Dead Horse Point State Park. This is a Utah state park adjacent to Canyonlands, and the entrance is right by the Canyonlands entrance. It's famous for this horseshoe bend on the cover of its brochure. This park overlooks the Colorado River. However, in the next few photos, you'll see some ponds. These are evaporation ponds for a mining operation. They recover potash. What they do is they pump water down into some salt beds underneath the ground. Up comes the potash, and then they evaporate it in these ponds. Here you start to see the Colorado River. People used to capture wild horses here because there were only one or two entrances to the whole area. For the horses they didn't want, they just left the gates open and let them go. However, some horses were too stupid to find their way out and they died, which was sad because they could actually see the water in the Colorado River below. But hence the name Dead Horse Point State Park. The next morning, it was raining down in Moab, and it was snowing at the higher elevations, so we stayed in Moab for the morning. However, in the afternoon, we decided to go back into Arches Park. We took the trail to Landscape Arch, shown here on the cover of the park brochure. There was a light dusting of snow on the mesas and mountains in the distance. We started getting sleet right away. It looks like rain in these pictures, but it's really not. It's actually little hard pellets of ice, which is really much better for hiking because you don't get wet. It actually changed the mood of the place quite a bit from the desert environment you're normally thinking of. It made a rather pleasant walk. This is where we started getting a full view of the landscape arch. It looks like there's a second arch in the background, but that is not really an arch. There were also two smaller arches to the right of landscape arch. In 1991, a portion of the underside of this arch did fall. It really should be called Delicate Arch. Someday the whole thing will fall. You can no longer walk underneath this arch as a result of that fall. The Devil's Garden Trail continues past Landscape Arch. It goes up this fairly steep incline of very slippery rock. In fact, it's so slippery because there's now ice and snow on it, and yet there were people on this. Now we're heading back from Landscape Arch. The snow and sleet did pick up a little at this point. We went down a side trail to two additional arches. The first of these is called Tunnel Arch for obvious reasons. The second arch here is called Pine Tree Arch because it has pine trees at the bottom. Now we head back to the main trail. This is near the trailhead where you can clearly see the pancake nature of these formations. This is how arches get started. We had some snow accumulation on our windshield while we were out walking. The next day we went back to the same landscape arches trail with everybody. It turned out it was a very sunny day and everything looked quite different. Here's the same two small arches next to landscape arch that we saw yesterday, but now you can see more clearly with the sunlight. Here's that same Devil's Garden trail that we saw yesterday, except that today it's much more reasonable to be climbing up. No ice or snow. On the way back, we enjoy some fall colors. Once again, Tunnel Arch, and once again, Pine Tree Arch. On the way back, we're just showing how close together the canyon walls can get. We're driving through Arches Park now. Notice that the distant mountains still have their light coating of snow. We're at what's called the courthouse area now. That includes the three gossips. In the afternoon, we took the trail to Delicate Arch, which is the famous one that shows up on license plates in Utah. The trail starts off flat, but then you realize there's a long line of people walking up a very rocky hill. This is looking back towards the parking lot where we came from. This is another view looking back to the parking lot. One of the smallest arches in the park is right along the trail. You could see Delicate Arch from here, through that little arch. This part of the trail had steep drop-offs, but at least it was flat. Finally, you come around the bend and see Delicate Arch. The drop-offs become very steep, especially to the back and also to the right of the arch. There's almost always somebody underneath the arch, so you can get a sense of the scale of the arch. Now we're headed back on the same trail. This is the spot where, on the way up, Linda almost fell. The path is very narrow, and as you can see, the drop-off is very steep. Linda's right on the edge right there. On the way up, the path splits into two, an upper trail and a lower trail. You can see a guy here who chose the upper trail on the way up. It's somewhat natural to take that upper trail to avoid the risk of slipping and avoiding that puddle on the lower trail. On the way up, Linda was walking first and chose the upper trail. That trail got steeper and steeper. The problem is this is slick rock, and it's called that for a reason. It has a lot of loose sand on it, and that sand was wet and even icy from the snows the previous day. Around this spot behind where Linda is now, she started sliding. Luckily, there were some people on the trail below that could catch her. This guy is continuing on his way up on the upper trail as we make our way down the trail. We did warn him that it gets slippery and steeper, but it had dried out some, so he didn't seem too worried. At this point, the guy realizes that it really is getting too slippery on this path. The original non-native settlers here were the Wolf family. Their ranch is right here at the trailhead. Amazingly, this is their new and improved cabin.